Today's lecture begins with an analysis of this creature. What is this thing? Obviously, it's a skeleton of something. If you're not used to looking at skeletons, it might be a little difficult for you to recognize that this is, in fact, a mammal. I think people who haven't seen very many skeletons have often thought that this was some kind of lizard or something like that, but it's not. If it were, the arms would be splayed out and it would not look like this at all. This is, for people who are used to looking at skeletons, very clearly a mammal. The question is, what kind of mammal is it? Now, this bar right here represents 10 centimeters, so this is not a very big thing. It's approximately the size of a house cat or so. And if you are used to looking at skeletons, this is reminiscent, at least this part of it is reminiscent of something you may have seen before. Take away the head, and the skeleton that you're looking at looks somewhat like a raccoon, except for these things at the end of the toes. Raccoons are different here. Raccoons have almost like little tiny hands. This very clearly does not have that. The skull, though, is very not raccoon-like. It's very different. So what is this thing, right? Does it exist? The answer is actually it doesn't exist on the planet anymore. This is a fossil that you're looking at. The fossil that you're looking at is this creature here. It's called Indohyus. This is a reconstruction of Indohyus, and you'll notice it's in the water. And the reason it's in the water is because there's evidence from strontium ratios of various isotopes in the bones and other evidence that indicated that this creature was in the water quite a lot. So it is a very interesting thing, and the people who studied this, when they first described it, made these statements, and here's the reference, number 11. If you go to the end of this lecture, you'll see a list of references. Indohyus was an animal similar in size to a cat, but quite different from a cat in shape. It had a long snout, long tail, long slender limbs, and at the end of each limb there were 4 or 5 toes, each ending in a hoof. Yes, it's a hoofed mammal. This is like a raccoon with hooves. What other kind of creatures have hooves? Well, deer. In fact, these guys' hooves are very much like a deer, which puts it into a group that biologists call the artiodactyls, although we're going to revise that later. But in this case, what other creatures have hooves? Well, cows, sheep, horses, pigs, donkeys, hippopotamuses, giraffes. Those are all hoofed mammals. But dogs, cats, obviously people, they don't. We don't have hooves. We have claws or nails or something else, but not hooves. This thing had hooves. So what in the world is this thing? It's like a raccoon with hooves. The other thing that's interesting about it, and there are many interesting things about this fossil, but one of the more interesting things for us is that its ear bones are weird. The ear bones have a thickened wall, thickened side of their edge, and it's so thick now it has like a fold in it. And that fold is called the involucrum. Now the involucrum is in this ear bone, which I'll explain here in just a moment. What's interesting about this feature is that the involucrum is found in cetaceans, whatever those are, and it's not found in any other mammals except for one, and that's this fossil Indohyus. Okay, now, interestingly enough, what are the cetaceans? You may not know. I can tell you right now, cetaceans are the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And these things live in water their entire lives, and they've got these weird ear bones. They've got these really thick ear bones. These guys have it too. So what are these ear bones that we're talking about here? Well, what you're looking at here is the underside of a dog skull. Okay, so here's the palate, the hard palate, there's the teeth, and so forth. And all these different things that are highlighted in different colors are different bones. Now, the skull is not a single bone. It's a number of bones that grow together and fuse together into one giant structure like this. And the different bones, like I said, are shaded different colors here. But the bone that we're interested in, the bone that we've been referring to, is this structure right here. You follow it on this side, and there's another one paired on the other side, followed right along here. Both of those are called auditory bullae or tympanic bullae. Okay, one of them is a bulla, 2 of them are bullae. So this is the kind of bones we're talking about, and this creature here, this Indohyus, had bones that are different, ear bones that are different than this dog's. It has one side that's really, really thick and has this fold that's called an involucrum. So Indohyus is a fossil. It's a raccoon-shaped mammal, but it had hooves like a deer, and it had ear bones like a whale, auditory bully like a whale's. So this is weird. This is a very strange creature. I'm going to introduce you to a number of strange creatures in this lecture, and what I want you to do is to learn the names and learn the characteristics that make them special. And we're going to put all this together. We're going to see how these characteristics meld into one another and tell us a story in a little bit. But for right now, make sure you get the names. Make sure you're able to identify the creature by a skeleton picture like this, for example, and be able to list the various characteristics. In this case, the characteristics are it had hooves, shaped like a raccoon, ear bones like a whale. All right, so here's another one. What in the world is this? Now, if you're looking at this, again, if you're not used to looking at skeletons, you might think, it looks like a crocodile. Because crocodiles are long and skinny like this, and they got these legs that are short and so forth. But again, if you are used to looking at skeletons, this is very clearly not a crocodile because crocodiles are reptiles, and this is a mammal. Okay, now it might be a good idea to think about what is a reptile and what's a mammal. Reptiles have scales, and they give birth to eggs, generally. Mammals have fur, give birth to live young, and use milk to feed those live young. Those are really three of the key definitions of what a mammal is. So this is not a mammal. This is not a reptile. This is a mammal. So where did it live? Okay, well, again, you can sort of tell from the structure of the animal's body, especially the way the legs are shaped here, although the legs could swing forward and go into this configuration here. It looks sort of like a water creature, which is why, again, it looks like a crocodile. Now, this has also been studied, and it's a fossil as well, and its name is Ambulocetus. Ambulo means to walk. Cetus is the same root as cetacean, dolphin, whales, and porpoises. So this thing, oddly enough, has the word whale in its title, but it's a walking whale. That's what literally this means. Ambulocetus means walking whale. Why is that? Well, it doesn't look like a whale, but what's interesting about it is it has some whale-like characteristics. Okay, now, its size is about the size of a large male sea lion, which means it's pretty big. I mean, it weighs hundreds of pounds. It's a big creature. And every single one of these toes right here, every single one here on the hind and the front limbs, both, ends in a small hoof. There's another weird thing. This thing also had hooves. It's a crocodile-like mammal that had hooves, like a deer. Interesting. So the other thing is we look at those ear bones, those auditory bully that I showed you here before, these things. These guys, this is why it's called a whale, they have auditory bully that are whale-like. They have a big, massive, thick involucrum. Okay? So that's really quite interesting. Now, interestingly enough, though, because those auditory bully are shaped the way they are, this creature is classified with the whales, among other features of its skull. But one of the interesting things is it's a little bit different than a whale. The way that auditory bulla connects to the skull is a little bit different. And in particular, this one's fused. It's very tight to the skull. And so this creature, even though it has the ear bones of a whale and has other characteristics of whales, it has some differences as well. But what's interesting, too, is that it's got hooves on the end of its fingers and toes. Very interesting sort of thing. How did it make its living? Well, we said it looked like a crocodile. So in hunting behavior, Ambulocetus may have been similar to a modern crocodile, and externally, Ambulocetus may have looked like a crocodile. So here's a reconstruction of it, sort of sitting around as what we call an ambush predator. It sits there and, like a crocodile would lay there in the water, floating in the water, trying to make people, or not people, but creatures think it's some kind of a log. And then this little Heracotherium, which is an early horse, gets too close to the water, and then boom, it gets snapped up by this guy. So this is another one of these fossils, and we want to try to understand why these fossils have these strange characteristics. Hooves, ear bones like whales, creatures that don't look like whales, and yet they all seem to be related through these odd characteristics like hooves and ear bones. So here's another skull. We're looking at the ventral view again. Ventral view means you're sort of looking up here. The lower jaw has been removed. What is this thing? I mean, look at this. What is it? Now, if you didn't know the size of this thing, you might think it was a bird, but it's way bigger than a bird. Bird skulls kind of look like that. But again, this one is very clearly mammalian. One of the things that's weird is this. Right there and right there, the auditory bulli are missing. They're supposed to be there, and they're not there. So where are they, and what the heck is this thing? What you're looking at here is a bottlenose dolphin skull. This is not a fossil. This is a creature that exists on the planet today. Scientific name is Tursiops truncatus. And this is the weird thing about this guy. Its auditory bulli have fallen off. Most of the modern whales and dolphins have auditory bulli with that involucrum, with that thickened side and folded side, but they also are detached from the skull. And that's what's interesting. Now, Ambulocetus and Indohyus, they were attached. They were still attached to the skull. But in this case, they fell off and they're detached. So this is a characteristic of cetaceans. They have these really, really thick ear bones that fall off. And these are all examples of ear bones of whales and dolphins. Right here, these are A and B, are fossilized baleen whales. Those are like the big blue whales and the right whales that filter feed. They've got all this stuff that hangs down in their mouth called baleen. And then this is a modern fin whale. This is a modern right whale. And these are fossilized whales that are called Odontocetes. And they have teeth. They're toothed whales. Now, all of them have these auditory bulli that fall off with this really thick part where the arrow is pointing. Every single one has this fold in it. And they are the only creatures on the planet today that have that weird ear bone. In the fossil record, however, we see that same trait in the ear bone of Indohyus and Ambulocetus. So this is interesting. These different creatures are connected together in some way. So here's a summary of what we've seen so far. When we look at traits, and this is general, this isn't just about the fossils that I've talked about, but when we look at traits in fossilized organisms and in living organisms, it tends to give us patterns where we can group those individuals based on those traits. For example, Indohyus and Ambulocetus had hooves, like the other groups of what we call the artiodactylids, or at least we used to call them artiodactylids. And that includes the hoofed mammals, where there's an even number of toes. So deer and things like that, elk, they have even numbers of toes. The Perissodactyla are hoofed mammals with odd numbers of toes, like a horse only has one. Okay, so that connects them together. The fact that they had hooves connects them into a group of hoofed mammals. But also, Indohyus ambulocetus and all of the cetaceans have this involucrum, have this folded, thickened part of their auditory bulli, and that collects them into a group. And what's interesting is when you have one characteristic, one trait, that collects individuals into a group, oftentimes there are other traits that fit into that group. So for example, Indohyus and Ambulocetus had hooves and the same kind of ear bones. Oddly though, the cetaceans don't have hooves. But of course they wouldn't. They swim in the water and so they have fins. We'll get to that in a moment. But the point is, these traits that collect organisms into groups are called synapomorphies, or synapomorphic traits. So these traits that are what we call shared derived characters, they are shared among all the members of a group. They're derived, meaning that they tend to be recent in those members of the group. They don't tend to be found earlier in fossils. And they are all collected together all the individuals are collected together in this group, and they're called synapomorphic. Now, synapomorphic traits are really, really important to biologists because it helps us see the patterns out in nature. Synapomorphic traits don't occur just in animals. They're in plants and all kinds of fungi, all sorts of other things. For us mammals, what makes mammals synapomorphic are traits that define the mammals. And that's what synapomorphic traits are. They're traits that define groups of organisms. For example, the mammals, like I said earlier, are defined as a group of organisms that have fur, that produce milk, and give birth to live young. And we also have other traits that, for example, we all share, like all mammals are warm-blooded. But that's not a synapomorphic trait for mammals because there are other species, birds, for example, probably the dinosaurs, are also warm-blooded. So just because we share a trait doesn't make it synapomorphic. Synapomorphy has to be a trait that we all have, but only us have. Mammals are the only creatures with fur. Mammals are the only creatures that produce milk. So those will be the synapomorphic traits. There are others as well, having to do with how our jaw articulates with our skull. And those you'll get into when you take your evolution course. But the point is, synapomorphic traits are critical. And so we really want to focus on those and understand what the synapomorphies are. I'm going to ask you a lot of times on the quiz and on the exam, what traits are synapomorphic in different groups. So in your notes, pay attention to that. Right now, we've seen synapomorphic traits, Indohyus, Ambulocetus, and all the whales and dolphins have that involucrum on their ear bones. And Indohyus and Ambulocetus are also synapomorphic with the Artiodactyla because they had hooves. So here's another interesting creature. This thing is indeed a fossil, and it's called a basilosaur. If you look at it, it's not that easy to tell exactly what this thing is. In fact, it was incorrectly called basilosaur, which literally means king lizard. It's not a lizard at all. Again, it's a mammal, and we can tell that from the bones, the way they're shaped, and also their physiology. We can actually get into the fossil and look at the physiology of the bone, and we can tell that this thing is very clearly a mammal. It's not a lizard of any sort or any other kind of reptile. But look at its shape. I mean, this thing is really cool looking. And in fact, if you read the paper that was one of the earlier ones that described it, said it has a nasal opening that's shifted far back toward the eyes to form a blowhole. Now, in most mammals, this nasal opening is here at the end of the snout, at the end of the rostrum. But here, it's way far back. So it'd be like you having your nostrils sort of almost up here at the bridge of your nose. And if you look here, this is an arm. Now, you're sort of looking at it square on, but it forms flippers. And not only that, but it had a fluke at the end of the tail. A fluke is that flat part of the tail in a dolphin or a whale that goes up and down and pushes it through the water. So this thing is obviously living in the water. It's got a blowhole like a whale, but it's not. Now, the blowholes in the whales are way back here in the back of the head, so this one's farther forward, and it has these flippers. So here's another reconstruction of it, actually a really excellent reconstruction of it. And you can see that it definitely has this interesting shape to it, like this. But I want to debate something here. Now, they say here, they even use the word flipper. Okay, remember, these kind of paddle-like things that the whales and dolphins have. And that's what they're claiming this is. Wait a minute now, look at this thing. Look at it carefully. Look at this picture. Now, this bone right here is called the scapula, and you've got one too. It's right there, right? It's shoulder blade. Now, there's this bone here, and it has a particular shape up here where it articulates, where it connects to the body, and another shape down here, and so on. And its basic shape is different, but not that different than this bone in your arm. This upper bone's called the humerus. Now, if you look a little bit further down, there's an elbow, and you see there's a knob, a bone knob that sticks off, just like you have. It's called the olecranon. And you can see there's two bones in what would be the forearm, and you have two bones there too as well. Okay, you have the ulna here and the radius on your thumb side. And then if you look here, it has bones in its wrist, and the same number of bones are in its wrist as in yours. And if you look here, it has these bones here, and there's 5 of them, just like you have these bones here. And then you've got fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers. This thing had 5 fingers. Look at this thing. It's not a flipper. It's a hand. That's an arm, isn't it? Right? So maybe we can debate this. And it's not, this really isn't necessarily a flipper. It looks like the thing's literally like this. It's like it's got its hands out, its arms out. Okay, let's look at a modern whale. This is a right whale. This is the second largest creature on the planet. It's huge. It's gigantic. Its heart is so big that the main blood vessel coming out of it at the very top, which we call the aorta, is so big that I could essentially get through it if I tried to squeeze through it. So this thing is huge. And look what it's got. There's the shoulder blade, the scapula. There's the upper arm bone, the humerus. There's that knob, the olecranon. So there's the ulna. This is the radius. It's got the same number of bones in its wrist as you have, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fingers. That's not a finger. That's part of this bone here that sticks off on your wrist. So that's also a hand. right? In fact, they even label it hand. It looks like a hand. Except this is a modern whale. You can tell this modern whale has a flipper. But this is what's interesting. Inside that flipper is an arm, just like yours. Humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, that's what these bones are called, and the phalanges that form the fingers. This is interesting. So why is it that we would have a hand and an arm in a flipper that's built like this? And that also means that they were right. This is a flipper. This is, even though it's shaped like a hand, flippers are shaped like hands. So there's more to it than this. Actually, if you look at all kinds of different body plans, for example, you look at flying mammals and reptiles, pterodactyls, they have the same sort of thing. There's the humerus there, the orange is the humerus. You got the radius and the ulna here. There's the radius, there's the ulna there, and it comes down, same thing here. And then you have the same number of carpals right here, and metacarpals and so forth. And then you have fingers. And what's interesting is, if you look at a bat, it has 5 fingers. If you look at a bird, it only has 3. And one of them is really small. And the pterodactyl, well, it has 5 too. 1, 2, 3, 4 little ones, and then this big long one. Okay, so interesting. This guy doesn't have 5 fingers, but most of them do. Actually, this bird did have 5 fingers as a fetus. As it was developing, it developed 5 fingers, and then 2 of them regressed, and you're left with only 3. Now, if you look at a dolphin or a seal, they have the same pattern. There's the humerus, there's the olecranon, there's the ulna, there's the radius, carpals, metacarpals, and then there's the phalanges. Same thing with the dolphin that we saw. So for swimming or flying, it's the same pattern. What about running? Same thing. Look at a sheep or a dog. Humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, metacarpals, all the same number, and in fact, at least in the embryo, always 5 fingers. Now again, sometimes they'll regress, and you get fewer than 5, but it's always in the embryo 5 for everything we see. And in us, of course, it's the same thing, and in a shrew, which is a little tiny mammal that tends to climb trees, those things actually are also in the same basic body plan. So that's one of the most important things, is when we're looking at the body plans of organisms, the body plans tend to be the same. They tend to have the same basic structure. Not just for the arm, but for the heart, for the central part of your body, the brain, the pelvis, the legs. They all basically have the same sort of basic body plan. But they're varied in what they do. There's a huge amount of variation in what they do. So why not build something specifically for swimming, which is fundamentally different than something specifically for flying? Because actually, if you build based on this one body plan, you end up with suboptimal designs. And there's quite a lot of examples of suboptimal designs. The NFL proves that. Most NFL football players, they can't survive for more than a few years of playing in the NFL. The average NFL football length of career is only about 3 to 5 years. And why do they stop playing? Not because they're not good enough to play anymore. It's because they get injured. What's the main injury? Not this, not concussion. The main injury is knee injuries. And it's because the knee is based on a body plan that could be engineered better. So it's a design flaw. It's a flawed design. So it's weird. Why would you do that? Why would you have this rigid body plan for various different functions when that leads to suboptimal designs? Right? So that's one problem we have to try to understand and solve.